People talking about their daily lives and telling their stories.
Today, the House Agriculture Committee.
Days before polling and the days before as aides would come in and say, here's what the public.
Just a couple moments left in this hearing. You can see it in its entirety at cspan.org. The Senate is gaveling in this morning to complete work on
The heavens speak of your wonders, and the skies declare what you have done. Let your everlasting grace and compassion encompass our senators today. Lord, give them such grace that they will be faithful in each task, striving to honor you in their work. May the work they do help provide for the security and well-being of our nation and world. Protect them and those they love by the power of your loving providence. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., May 15, 2013. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable William M. Cowan, a senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Following later remarks, the Senate will be in period of morning business till 10:30. The Republicans will control the first half, majority the final half. Following that morning business, the Senate will resume consideration of the Water Resource Development Act. There will be up to 7 roll call votes to complete action on this bill, and we're going to start the voting at about 10:30 this morning. Mr. President, there's a lot going on here, committee's meeting, but I want to alert all senators, my Democrats and the Republicans. We have a lot of votes to do, and we're not going to wait around while someone strolls in. We're going to, first vote, I direct this question to the chair. Are the final 6 votes 10-minute votes? So the first vote will be the regular 15-minute vote. After that, it's 10 minutes. And I'm alerting everyone we're going to close the votes as quickly as we can so we can finish this. The Republicans have an important meeting beginning before 1 o'clock today, so we're going to move through these votes just as quickly as we can. We also, Mr. President, expect votes today on confirmation of Marilyn Tavenner to be Administrator for Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, and we may get to see if we can finish the Orrick nomination to be a judge for the Northern District, California. Mr. President, I am told that S-953 is due for a second reading.
Clerk will report.
S-953, a bill to amend the Higher Education Act of 1965, and so forth, and for other purposes.
I would object to any further proceedings on this bill at this time.
Objections heard. The bill will be placed on the calendar.
Mr. President, Albert Einstein, the great Albert Einstein, defined insanity as follows: doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. That's what Albert Einstein said. If his definition is true, and I'm not to argue with Einstein, the House Republicans have truly lost their minds. This week, the House of Representatives will vote for the 37th time. Mr. President, 37th time. What are they voting on 37 times? Exactly the same thing. They're voting to repeal the landmark constitutional health care reform bill known as Obamacare now. And I say that proudly. After last year's election, Speaker Boehner conceded that Obamacare is here to stay. Here's what he said, and I quote, "It's pretty clear that the president was reelected." I think that's a fair statement. He went on to say, "Obama is the law of the land." Again, the Speaker said, it's pretty clear that President Obama was reelected and Obamacare is the law of the land. So no matter what he said then, this is now, and he's changed his mind. The House will waste yet another week on another dead-end repeal vote. Perhaps Republicans think the 37th time is the charm. 37 times on the exact same thing. Tea Party extremists bullied the Speaker into holding yet another vote to repeal the Affordable Care Act and roll back benefits for tens of millions of Americans. This is what the Speaker said last week. This is a quote. "We've got 70 new members who have not had an opportunity to vote on the President's health care law. Frankly, they've been asking for an opportunity to vote on it." Close quote. Mr. President, this political kabuki has tied up the floor of the House of Representatives for weeks and cost the American taxpayers $52.4 million and counting. These are figures compiled by CBS News. Just wasting 37 votes of all the House staff and all other personnel that have responsibilities for making sure that place runs as well as it does. That money, $52.4 million, is enough to restore funding for 19 million meals for homebound seniors, or 6,900 children dropped from the Head Start program. But while the vote may be political theater, it does have one benefit. The American people will know where the freshman class of House Republicans stand. I think we know, but they'll get another opportunity to see this. Do they stand with millions of Americans who are already benefiting from Obamacare? We know that answer. Or do they stand with insurance companies? We know that answer. The insurance companies who would like nothing better than to have things the way they used to be, than to once again deny coverage to sick children, impose lifetime caps on care, and discriminate against those with pre-existing conditions. Since President Obama signed the Affordable Care Act into law, insurance companies can no longer put profits ahead of people. One of the provisions in this bill says that of premiums paid to insurance companies for health care, 80% of those benefits must go to patients. No longer, as they did, 50% of the premium goes for salaries, bonuses, and other perks for insurance executives. No longer. Insurance companies can no longer discriminate against children with pre-existing conditions. They can no longer raise your rates for no reason. They can no longer drop your coverage if you get sick. Mr. President, that's what happened. But this week, for the 37th time, House Republicans will try to change all that. Here are a few of the other benefits already in effect that House Republicans would eliminate. In Nevada, Mr. President, we're not a heavily populated state like Massachusetts or California or New York, but we're getting bigger. We have about 3 million people. In Nevada alone, tens of thousands of seniors have saved tens of millions of dollars on medicines because the Affordable Care Act closed the gap on prescription drugs. That means millions of seniors across this country have more money in their pockets for food, gas, electric bills. More than 3 million young people, because of Obamacare, including 33,000 young Nevadans, have benefited from a provision in the law that allows children to stay on their parents' health plans until they're 26 years old. That means no person will have to worry about getting sick while looking for a job that offers insurance. Or they can go to college. Mr. President, in my little town of Searchlight, Nevada, a boy made a decision. Was he going to join the military, very patriotic family, or should he go to school? And he made the decision he was going to go to school. And the family is not one of means. His mom worked part-time in a post office, and his dad worked at a power plant about 40 miles from Searchlight. They were so happy. This boy was going to go to college, the first person in their family to go to college. And he did extremely well. Finished 1 year, he's in his second year, and he started feeling some discomfort. He had testicular cancer. The time had passed. He was 23 years old, no longer could be on his parents' insurance. They had no insurance to cover this cancer that their son had, their youngest boy. And they begged and borrowed and literally, I shouldn't say begged, they didn't do that, but they had a difficult time. He needed 2 surgeries. The Republicans in the House, I guess, want to go back to that. Maybe the Republicans here, they love voting against Obamacare provisions, want to go back to a time when that boy, Jeff, would no longer have insurance. That's what they want these people, these young men and women who are trying to go to college, get a job. They want to go back to that time. It's 3 extra years now, Mr. President. That means a lot. Under Obamacare, hundreds of thousands of businesses that already offer their employees health insurance are getting tax credits for doing the right thing. That means small business owners can spend their capital on growing their firms instead of growing insurance premiums. Thanks to the Affordable Care Act, insurance companies can no longer set arbitrary lifetime caps on benefits, as they did. What does that mean? There's a provision hidden in that policy they sold you that when your benefits reach $50,000, coverage stops. It doesn't matter if you've been hurt in an automobile accident or you had cancer or some other dread disease. It used to stop. Not anymore. Because of the Affordable Care Act, millions of Americans are no longer one car accident or heart attack away from bankruptcy. Today, children can no longer be denied coverage because they're born with a disease or a disability, a protection that will soon extend to all Americans. And soon, being a woman will no longer be a pre-existing condition. I said it right, Mr. President. No longer will being a woman be a pre-existing condition. My daughter has a pre-existing condition. Why? She's a woman, but no longer. In a few months, 129 million Americans with pre-existing conditions such as high blood pressure or epilepsy can rest assured they'll have access to affordable insurance and life-saving care regardless of how much money they make or don't make. And soon, 25 million more Americans who can't afford health insurance will have access to reasonably priced insurance and quality care. But if Republicans get their way, these benefits and more will disappear. There's going to be a vote take place in the House of Representatives to repeal everything that I've talked about. Not change it, repeal it. Obama led the charge here, and we were able to pass the Affordable Care Act, the most significant change in health care delivery system since Medicare. That was many, many years ago. It ensures access to quality, affordable health care for every American. But Republicans would erase these gains, force millions of American families to once again rely on expensive emergency room care, or go without care at all. Fortunately, Republicans' latest exercise in insanity, as described by Albert Einstein, that is, their latest repeal effort, is doomed to fail like the previous 36.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
It seems like with each passing hour, the facts get more and more inconvenient for senior folks over at the IRS. Yesterday, it was reported that the agency may have gone after a ministry founded by Billy Graham. We also learned that the very same IRS office that admitted to harassing conservative groups also released 9 pending applications for tax-exempt status to the liberal group ProPublica. How did we find out? Well, ProPublica revealed it. Basically, all we've gotten from the IRS, on the other hand, is an attempt to scapegoat some folks out in Cincinnati in a laughable attempt to move past this whole issue with a ridiculous op-ed claiming, quote, mistakes were made. Well, most folks don't think that ignoring the Constitution is simply a mistake. I like the fact that one group the IRS targeted when asked by the agency to provide reading materials related to their mission simply mailed them a copy of the Constitution. And today I'd like to encourage every group that feels like it's been unjustly targeted to do the same thing. Maybe just underline the First Amendment before you put it in the envelope, because that's what this is all about. But getting back to the latest news, the leak to ProPublica, let's be clear about what that means. The IRS is forbidden from providing that kind of information about groups that haven't been approved. It's a bright-line prohibition that even the lowest staffers at IRS should surely know about. And we intend to find out the relevant details. Yesterday, I said the administration needs to fully comply with all congressional inquiries on the matter. This ProPublica leak will unquestionably be one of them. The administration needs to make witnesses available to testify on this and on any other incident of targeting the administration's ideological opponents, and to resist the temptation to stonewall or obfuscate what took place. Today, other Senate Republicans are joining me in this call. More than 40 members have signed a letter demanding as much of the President. If the President's truly concerned about this issue, as he claims, he'll work openly and transparently with us to get to the bottom of what happened. And people will be held accountable. These allegations are very serious. That there was an effort to bring the power of the federal government to bear on those the administration disagreed with in the middle of a heated national election. It actually could be criminal. And we're determined to get the answers. Again, let's not forget that we wouldn't know any of this. We wouldn't know any of this if congressional Republicans hadn't demanded better answers than the ones we were getting from this administration. When I and several of my colleagues wrote to the IRS last year, seeking clarification of allegations that they were harassing conservative groups, the response we got was essentially, nothing to see here, move along. When I pressed the issue in a speech last June, the left either ridiculed the suggestion or ignored it. When IRS officials were asked point blank in congressional hearings whether this was happening, they said it wasn't. Well, of course, it turned out it was. It did happen. And by the way, you know who didn't have any trouble getting information out of the IRS? Who didn't have any trouble at all getting information out of the IRS? ProPublica, which was pushing an ideological agenda friendly to this administration. When they asked the IRS for information, they got it in 12 days. 12 days. Some of it wasn't supposed to be released. When I asked the IRS for information, when did I get it? ProPublica got it in 12 days. When did I get it? Only when it was coming out anyway in an IG report. So there are a lot of unanswered questions that remain. Which officials knew about the scandal? When did they know about it? What did they do when they found out? Did they deliberately mislead Congress and the American people? The number of officials involved continues to grow. And now with this revelation from ProPublica, it appears that the campaign against conservative groups was of a broader scope than originally admitted. So it's no surprise that the American people are demanding more than just some half-hearted apology made under duress. That isn't going to cut it. As an activist from one of the targeted groups in Kentucky said yesterday, apology not accepted. There are many questions that still need to be answered. There are many that remain unanswered. My constituent was absolutely right. Mr. President, I'm going to ask consent that the letter signed by my colleagues appear in the record at this point.
Without objection.
And on another unrelated matter, let me take a few moments here to point out that this week we mark National Police Week as a time to pay tribute to the service and sacrifice of many men and women in federal, state, and local law enforcement across America. It's an appropriate time for those of us who benefit from their efforts, and that is actually all of us, to express our gratitude. The nation's capital welcomes thousands of police officers who are gathering to celebrate National Police Week. They will honor their fallen fellow officers and rededicate themselves to their duties of defending the property, dignity, and lives of those who would fall prey to criminals outside the law. I want to especially recognize the many men and women who work to enforce the law in my home state of Kentucky. Many of them have traveled to Washington this week, and today I will have the pleasure of meeting with some of Kentucky's finest. I want to personally thank them for bravely risking their lives in service to our people across the Commonwealth. Earlier this month in Richmond, in my state, a solemn ceremony was held at the Kentucky Law Enforcement Memorial on the campus of Eastern Kentucky University. This memorial lists the names of every known fallen peace officer in Kentucky history. Along the bottom of it are the words, "Blessed be the peacekeepers." The ceremony was held to add the names of 2 law enforcement officers from Kentucky who were killed in the line of duty in 2012. Hodgenville police officer Mark Talby was killed in a vehicle pursuit on September the 16th. Marion County Sheriff's Deputy Anthony Rakes was shot during a traffic stop on November the 14th. I want to express my sympathies to the families of officers Talby and Deputy Rakes for their tragic loss. Their names will be added along with 6 other Kentucky peace officers whose names had not been previously on the memorial. There will be a total of 509 brave Kentuckians on that wall. I know my colleagues in the U.S. Senate join me in holding the deepest admiration and respect for many brave law enforcement officers across Kentucky and the nation. Theirs is both an honorable profession and a dangerous one. It is also a necessary one, as the maintenance of peace and order in a civil society that we take for granted simply could not exist without them. Kentucky is grateful to our law enforcement officers and their families, and we're grateful for the sacrifice of Officer Mark Talby and Sheriff's Deputy Anthony Rakes to preserve the rule of law. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the names of the Commonwealth of Kentucky law enforcement officers added to the Kentucky Law Enforcement Memorial this year be included in the record following my remarks.
Without objection.
I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 10:30 a.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the 2 leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half. The Republican whip.
Mr. President, like millions of Americans, the events of the last few days and the last few months have caused me to reflect on the nature of our federal government and our special system of federalism, which delegates to the federal government certain powers but reserves to the states and the people those remaining powers. That's roughly what the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution says. I've also reflected a little bit on what some wise people have said over our history and even before America was founded about the nature of power, government power. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Our founders pointed out in the Federalist Papers and elsewhere that a concentration of powers in the hands of a few is the very definition of tyranny. And we've learned from hard experience over the course of our nation's history that when government thinks it knows best, particularly here in Washington, in a country as big and diverse as ours is, that the natural tendency then in Washington is to try to suppress the voices of those who see things differently, those who want to exercise their constitutional rights, particularly to free speech, freedom of association, and yes, even freedom of the press. It's not true to say we haven't been warned about the dangers of concentration of power in the federal government and big government and the human frailties that follow. We have been warned time and time and time again. And now we've been reminded once again of the wisdom of our founders and the wisdom of the structure of the United States Constitution. Over the last week, a series of events have highlighted the administration's massive credibility gap. First, we learned more details about the coordinated attempt to misrepresent the September 2012 terrorist attack in Benghazi, Libya. You may recall immediately after that attack, the President had a press conference, and he said later, well, I said it was a terrorist attack then. That was reviewed by the fact-checker in the Washington Post, hardly an unsympathetic newspaper editorially to the administration's point of view, and the fact-checker gave the President of the United States 4 Pinocchios. Some ask, well, why 4 Pinocchios? I think the true answer is because they never give 5 Pinocchios. Maybe they do, but you get the point. And of course, we cannot escape the fact, and we should not ignore the fact, that this attack took 4 American lives. Then we learned this last week that a senior IRS official had acknowledged that her agency deliberately targeted certain political speech and activity for harassment, using the instruments of power given to the Internal Revenue Service, perhaps the most awesome, pervasive, and potentially intrusive power the federal government has in the hands of that agency. Interestingly, the White House counsel said she learned about it in April. The President said he didn't learn about it until later. An investigation needs to be undertaken, and I'm happy that Senator Max Baucus, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and Senator Orrin Hatch, the ranking member of the Finance Committee, have committed themselves to doing an investigation of the IRS and how this could possibly happen. On top of all that, the top administrator of Health and Human Services, Secretary Kathleen Sebelius, has been soliciting funds from the very industries she regulates to help implement Obamacare. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to imagine the potential for coercion by the government of these private sector industries because of their fear of retribution if they don't contribute to this effort. A huge conflict of interest, and perhaps illegal. We need to get to the bottom of that as well. So whether the issue is a terrorist attack in Libya, political and partisan abuses by the IRS, or efforts by the Department of Health and Human Services to shake down the health insurance industry they regulate, it appears that the birds have come home to roost that the founders warned us about. The concentration of government power invariably leads to abuse of that power, and it's the same old story of human frailties over and over again. And it's no respecter of political parties. It's happened in both political parties. And we should have been more careful. We should have listened. We should not have persistently engaged in this power grab for Washington, D.C. at the expense of individual liberty on the part of the American people. So what's the price to be paid by these scandals? Well, the first price is a lack of credibility and public confidence in the most basic institutions that make up this government. The other damage is to the credibility of folks at the highest level of the administration. After all, if the administration were willing to prevaricate, mislead, and dissemble about an al-Qaeda-linked attack in Benghazi that cost the life of 4 Americans, what else are they willing to prevaricate, mislead, and dissemble about? Can the public trust this administration? Can the public trust its government to provide accurate information about the war on terror or anything else? Similarly, if IRS officials knew that their agency was targeting certain political activity and failed then to hold anyone accountable, how can the American people ever trust the Internal Revenue Service or the federal government to be neutral and law-abiding? I heard the junior senator from Virginia on the radio as I came in this morning, Senator Kaine, who asked, I thought, a pretty good question. He said, what does it take to get fired in this town? What does it take to get fired in this administration for cover-ups, for misleading the American people? If Secretary Sebelius is willing to strong-arm the very industry she regulates to fund the implementation of Obamacare, can the American people trust her agency to be objective, even-handed, and fair-minded as a regulator? All this boils down into a very sad statistic that demonstrates that the public's confidence in the federal government, and particularly in Congress, is at an all-time low. That's not the end of the story. Shouldn't be the end of the story. That ought to be the beginning of a bipartisan effort to get to the bottom of these abuses, but also to restore ourselves to the constitutional framework that our founding fathers envisioned when this great experiment in democracy was created more than 200 years ago. It wasn't a national government that dictated to the rest of the country how you should run your life, what choices you should make. It was a federal system of separated powers with checks and balances, with authority given to the federal government to do things that individuals and the states could not do by themselves, like national defense, But we've gotten far afield from the framers' vision of how our country should operate, or from the constitutional system that they created and which we celebrate. Now more than ever, Washington needs credibility. If you don't have the public's trust, how in the world are you ever going to gain their confidence that we are going to address the many challenges that our country faces? I'm not pessimistic about our future. I am optimistic about our future, but it will take a change of attitude. It will take a change of behavior. It will take, in some sense, a return to the Founders' philosophy on the framework and the structure in which our government operates. Because for too long, the federal government has said, we know best. If you don't like it, it's because we haven't given you enough information to convince you to like it, and to take the policies that are unpopular and merely to shove them down the throat of the American people and think we're doing our job. But we know we have huge challenges which call on us to work together on a bipartisan basis to regain the public's confidence, and I know we can do it if we will. It's a matter of whether we have the political courage and the will to do it. And here are some of those challenges. The longest period of high unemployment since the Great Depression. The largest percentage of the American workforce that's simply given up and quit looking for jobs because the economy is so weak. The second challenge is a woefully unpopular health care law that even some of the architects of that law now say they see a train wreck occurring in its implementation. And we know our world continues to be dangerous, as Benghazi reminds us, and we see from murderers like Bashar al-Assad of Syria and people who threaten innocent people with chemical weapons and murder, fighting for their very lives in places like Syria, and Iran on a pathway to develop a nuclear weapon which will completely disrupt the balance of power in the Middle East and create an arms race while other countries seek their own nuclear weapon. And let's not forget Iran is the primary state sponsor of international terrorism with its support for Hezbollah, among others. And we've seen in North Africa and elsewhere the proliferation of al-Qaeda affiliates and allies. And yes, we also need to fix our broken immigration system. Now, none of these individually are easy things to do. All of them are hard, but they're not impossible. If we will try to work hard to regain the public's credibility, and we will simply do our work and respect the wisdom of the ages when it comes to concentration of power and its impact on individual liberty. And the temptation when power is absolute to see that power corrupted and abuse that power when it comes to dealing with the American people. Unfortunately, so far, the Obama administration has valued its agenda more than its credibility. Without regaining credibility, we will never regain the public's trust. And without that trust, it will be much, much harder to solve America's biggest problems. That is the biggest single challenge to President Obama's second-term agenda, and to our ability as Americans to show that this 200-plus year experiment in self-government actually works. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Oregon.
Ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk about why the events of the last 24 hours drive home how valuable it would be to have a House-Senate budget conference begin to meet and to deal with the extraordinary set of fiscal challenges our country has in front of us. As the President of the Senate knows, a number of senators on our sides have been trying to get a budget conference with the House. It's been several months since the budget resolutions, the respective bodies have in effect been set in motion. And I want to talk about what's happened in the last 24 hours because it again drives home how valuable it would be for the Senate and the House to move to a budget conference at this time. Yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office, of course our official arbiter of budget numbers and trends, made public a new report showing that there has been a significant reduction in the budget deficit. In fact, their analysis shows that there's been something like a 24% reduction from what was estimated just a few months ago. Now, you couple that new evidence from the Congressional Budget Office with the fact that consumers continue to spend, which is certainly encouraging, the housing market coming back, employers adding 165,000 jobs in April, all of this drives home that in the short term, Mr. President, the economy is picking up and we're making real progress. The point of a budget resolution, on the other hand, is to give us a chance to look long-term, to look at the next 10 years, how Democrats and Republicans can come together, for example, on the long-term challenge of holding down health care costs. We have certainly seen progress, again, in the last few months on that. There's a debate about why health costs have been moderating of late. I happen to think it's because providers and others are beginning to see what's ahead, but we can have that debate, and certainly there is a lot more to do in terms of holding down health care costs for the long term. That's what I'd like to see the Senate and the House go to in terms of the budget resolution. For example, I think I've talked about it with the President and the Senate before, chronic care is where most of the Medicare money goes. This is for people with heart, stroke, diabetes, cancer, these kinds of challenges. We've got some ideas that we believe could be bipartisan, would be exactly the kind of thing the House and the Senate should take up in a conference on the budget, which we have been seeking for some time. And I only come to the floor today by way of trying to lay out why the events just of the last few days dramatize how useful it would be for the Senate and the House to start thinking about what the country really cares about, which is our long-term trends. In fact, this morning I was struck by the fact that some economic theorists say that the Congress has really, over the last few months, really had it backwards. We have been consumed with everything short-term, when in fact we ought to say, look at some of those positive developments that I just cited, including the Congressional Budget Office numbers here recently, that would indicate that maybe a little bit less of the back and forth and what certainly voters see as unduly partisan should give way to some thoughtful long-term efforts in sort of that 10-year window, which is really what's examined on the budget side. I would also point out, Mr. President, that some of the leading Republicans, some of the arch-conservatives with respect to economic analysis are all saying the same thing, that we ought to be talking about long-term trends, which Democrats have said, and I cite again today, is a reason for a budget conference. Glenn Hubbard, for example, one of the most respected of the conservatives, talks continually about the long-term challenge and the dangers, Mr. President, of waiting. Well, on this side of the aisle, we're saying we don't want to wait anymore in terms of getting a budget conference. We want to be in a position to tackle these major kinds of questions. pro-growth tax reform. Tax reform that can, again, generate, revenue. And we have some ideas that we'd like to raise in a budget conference that we think would be attractive to the other side. So I hope that colleagues who have had questions about whether or not there ought to be a budget conference now, an actual budget conference between the Senate and the House, will look at these matters anew, given these kind of trends I would point out. And tell you the truth, I'm encouraged on this point. We've heard colleagues in the last few days on the other side of the aisle say, yes, they too think that this is time for an actual budget conference between the House and the Senate. They've called for it for a long time. We've now got a chance to not just call for it, but actually do it. And if anything, the economic news that I've cited suggests that some of the focus on these short-term, trends really ought to give way to more emphasis on bipartisan concern for the long-term trends, which are, in particular, going to revolve around health care, especially Medicare, and taxes, where we have an opportunity to look at bipartisan approaches for tax reform. And I commend particularly Senator Baucus and Senator Hatch, our leadership on the Finance Committee, on which I serve, who've been talking with senators in weekly sessions that they've pulled together on particularly the tax reform issue. So you couple, Mr. President, the opportunity for the long term, looking at things like chronic health care, which is where most of the Medicare dollar goes, where I think there are some good opportunities, protecting the rights of seniors while having quality care and holding costs down. Those are the things that you could really look at in the longer term, which is what a budget resolution, Mr. President, is really all about. So it's been 2 months since the House and Senate adopted their respective budget resolutions. I think, if anything, what we have learned in the last few days is yet more evidence why senators and House members of goodwill who want to tackle the long-term economic challenge, which, if anything, becomes increasingly important day by day, we ought to go to a budget conference and go forthwith to that effort in a bipartisan way. Later on in the morning, Mr. President, I intend to propound a unanimous consent request to, in fact, go to that conference with the House on the budget. And I would just urge colleagues, I know Senator Coburn is here, and I commend him because he's been one who's been interested in tackling long-term fiscal challenges. Long-term fiscal challenges, Mr. President, is what a debate between the House and the Senate over the next 10 years and the future trends that we're looking at are going to be front and center. We can tackle those questions, particularly on health care and taxes, by going to a conference looking at the long term, and we would also be, in my view, picking up on what economists and leaders in the private sector of both political parties are saying now, which is there should be a little bit less of a focus on short-term sparring about our economy and more of a focus on the long-term economic challenges, which is what a House-Senate budget conference looking at the 10 years ahead could be all about. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor. President, I would note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Oklahoma.
I'd ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
We're still in morning business, and I'll speak as if in morning business about two amendments that I will call up when we get out of morning business. One is amendment number 815 on this bill, which is really aimed at lessening state dependence on the federal government. We now, over a period of 50 years, help with beach nourishment. And in this bill is a section that extends from 50 to 65 years government subsidization of beach nourishment. And really, if you look at it, it's targeted for just a few states because they're running into the 50-year headline. And so all it does is block it from going from 50 to 65 years. The Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Obama Fiscal Commission all recommended eliminating the federal subsidization of beach nourishment projects. So you've had great leadership, bipartisan leadership on both sides of the aisle to bring this back and put what is truly a state responsibility there. And in this bill, what we're doing is furthering the dependence of states for beach nourishment projects on the federal government. So I'll call up that amendment. The next amendment is Amendment 816, which this committee has done a great job in setting up a review board that can eliminate authorized projects that no longer make sense. But they've limited what they can look at. They're not letting them look at the whole water resources projects, and so therefore they limit those amendments. And all we're saying with this amendment is you ought to open it back up. Now, one of the criticisms of this amendment is that a project may be in the midst of completion, and the review board might say, you should eliminate it. It doesn't mean we'll eliminate it, because in the wisdom of the committee, what they did is they gave the opportunity for Congress to disallow any of this. So I think what the committee has done is a great step forward in getting rid of projects that are no longer apropos to whatever the needs are. But my question is why did they limit it to such a narrow package when, in fact, they want this outside input to help guide us on what we should do? So at the appropriate time, when we're out of morning business, I will call up those amendments, and I won't speak further on them, just call them up, and so we can move ahead with the bill. And I see the chairwoman of the committee is here, and good morning to her. And I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from California.
Mr. President, for the benefit of all senators, we are moving forward today, and I thank all colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Senator Vitter and I have tried to allow all kinds of amendments. We did. Unfortunately, yesterday there was an objection to one contentious amendment, and Senator Landrieu was, she really took one for the team and withdrew her amendment because she wanted to make sure this WRDA bill moves forward. And I appreciate that, because it's a very important issue about flood insurance, and it's complicated, and I know how strongly she feels, and I know she'll be back. So we have a number of amendments, and we'll be debating them a minute aside. I did want to address my friend from Oklahoma, because let me tell you, we've been on opposite sides on his amendments. I don't like that very much, but when we do work together, we win big. When we don't, then it doesn't work out well for either of us. So I'm sorry to say that my friend's two amendments I'm going to have to oppose. And I want to lay on the record in a little more time than a minute why. We do something really important in this bill. We create a new infrastructure deauthorization commission to review the backlog of core projects and develop a list of projects that will be deauthorized unless Congress passes a joint resolution opposing the commission's recommendation. It's kind of like the Base Closure Commission, where the Base Closure Commission comes forward and says, these are the bases that will be closed. Now, it is a very cumbersome process to overturn the commission. And we did that on purpose, because we know that politics plays a part in a lot of these things, and we want the commission to have power. Now, my friend, I'm sure that he's grateful that we have set up this commission, because what he's trying to do is cut even more projects out. I just want to make the case that when we did this in the committee, we really developed a careful balance, and we give the Infrastructure Deauthorization Committee a lot of authority here. But this amendment removes the bill's limitations on what projects can be deauthorized. So this is, in our bill, this is what we say to the Commission. We give guidance to the Commission. We say projects authorized these are the projects that can be deauthorized, in other words, stopped. Because I share my friend's view. We don't want to keep projects going that are really doomed and not going anywhere. It's a waste of taxpayer dollars, and frankly, it gives people, it makes it very confusing for people back home because they don't understand a project that started in 1996 or something is still alive. Well, what we do here is projects authorized or reauthorized after the enactment of the Water Resources Development Act of '96, projects currently undergoing review by the Corps, projects that have received appropriations in the last 10 years, projects that are more than 50% complete, projects that have a viable non-federal sponsor, they would not be deauthorized. They would not be deauthorized. So let me say it again. Projects that would not be deauthorized are projects authorized after 1996, projects currently undergoing review by the Corps, projects that have received appropriations in the last 10 years, projects that are more than 50% complete, projects that have a viable non-federal sponsor. So we do give guidance to the Commission. We say, other than that, go for it and deauthorize. The provision Senator Coburn wants to strike was included to focus the attention of the Commission on the older, truly inactive projects. I mean, that's really what we're about. The Coburn Amendment would give unlimited discretion to the Commission to deauthorize a project, even if it's in the middle of construction or it has an active non-federal sponsor. I mean, imagine you have a city or a county or even a private sector participant who's involved, and all of a sudden everything they've done is for naught. And I just think what it does, it creates havoc. I know my friend is the best of intentions. And his point that we can overturn the Commission, it's a valid point. But let's be clear here. How many bills actually become a law around here these days? It's hard to even pass a resolution saying Happy Mother's Day. So we have a hard time. So to say that the Congress could actually overturn the Commission, we've never done it in a base closure commission. We wouldn't do it here. Now, states and local communities have invested millions of dollars in local cost shares for project feasibility studies. It isn't fair to these communities that have committed significant resources to deauthorize a project that remains active and is moving forward. So, in essence, this amendment would disrupt the new deauthorization process created in WRDA 2013, and I urge my colleagues to oppose that amendment. Now, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to place in the record a letter from the National Construction Alliance. It reads, the National Construction Alliance strongly opposes the Coburn Amendment. It says communities can't afford to have the rug pulled out from beneath them. And I think it's important to note that they don't in any way chastise the committee for our work. We also have opposition from the road builders. In my concluding moments, I want to say we also will have a Coburn Amendment on striking the Section 2030 on beach nourishment extension. I think it's very important that this be defeated because many of these existing projects provide critical storm damage protection for coastal communities, which require periodic nourishment to maintain this protection. There are dozens of important shoreline protection projects around the country that have benefits that exceed the cost. Hurricane Sandy demonstrated that federal shoreline protection projects fared better against the storm surge than other areas impacted by the storm. And we have seen this. Where there was beach nourishment, they had a lot less damage, and the people were spared. So in our work on WRDA, the EPW committee held hearings on the Corps' flood and storm damage reduction projects. We received testimony from local communities, such as Ocean City, Maryland, which highlighted the hundreds of millions of dollars in damages avoided by these projects. Section 2030 in WRDA 2013 does not provide a blanket extension of all beach nourishment shore protections. The section simply allows the Corps to study projects and to make a recommendation to Congress. And I don't know why we would want to stop this, since we know after Sandy that some of these projects really had a cost-benefit for the people, for the taxpayers. Before receiving an extension, a project has to go through a feasibility analysis to demonstrate it is still in the national interest. has to have a positive cost-benefit ratio, is technically feasible, it's environmentally acceptable. So the provision Senator Coburn is attempting to strike doesn't guarantee an extension. It just tells the Corps to study the issue and come back with a recommendation. And I honestly believe that blocking federal investment in these projects will harm coastal communities. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this Coburn amendment, and I know I speak for many, including Senator Lautenberg, who actually brought this issue to my attention years ago. I would yield the floor and note that the time has come to debate the Coburn amendment 1 minute aside.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of Senate 601, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 44S601, a bill to provide for the conservation and development of water and related resources, and so forth, and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to set aside the pending amendment called Coburn Amendment 815.
Clerk will report.
The Senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, proposes amendment number 815.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to set aside